Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Olivier Prost, and I'm partner in charge of the international trade team with Gide. I would, well, first of all, I welcome all of you. I would first make a technical point. All participants to this webinar are in mute. But of course, if you have a question at any point during the webinar, do not hesitate to send it to the moderators using the questions bar in the configuration panel. Before I give the floor to the moderators, Nadia's and James Casey from our Brussels office and London office, I would like to introduce this seminar by making some general consideration. The United Kingdom, which is about to leave the European Union, will take back control of its trade defense legislation that it had ceded to Europe for 47 years almost. What will this renationalization of British trade defense policy mean? It is no secret that during its European Union years, the UK has never been the strongest supporter of TDI measures against imports from countries around the world. The UK often considered that trade defense duty were detrimental to British consumer and the economy in general, and also prevented the UK from benefiting fully from free trade. This position was often coupled with the perhaps excessive notion that the UK's economy was essentially finance and services, with fewer and fewer industry to defend under TDIs. But hasn't the revival of British manufacturing industry become a new priority for the British government in recent years? Moreover, is not the world of international trade over the last 15 years, during which the UK was in the European Union, radically different from the one we have today? New challenges are arising, which, Brexit or not, are shaking up the old Europe, and which will have to be met without ideology, but with pragmatism. So, is it not a common imperative for the United Kingdom and Europe to remain open to the world, but also with open eyes? This means not being protectionist, but ensuring a level playing field for companies and their employees, particularly in the area of industrial subsidies. While free trade is good, free and fair trade is preferable. With its task force, which brings together its Brussels and London offices and its more than 30 years of experiences in the field of European TDIs, Gide is both very pleased and eager to give a voice to those within the UK authorities who will implement the new UK TDI rules and policy. And our aim today is to make sure that when participants leave the webinar, they have a good understanding of what to do when facing unfair international competition in the UK. I will now hand over to our moderators, again, Anadias and James Casey, to introduce the speakers. Please, James.
Thank you, Olivier. We are very lucky to have Clare Brodie with us, who is General Counsel of the Trade Remedies Investigations Directorate, TRID. Clare has extensive experience in EU, international and economic law matters, and has worked in London and Brussels in private practice and a variety of EU and competition related roles within government. Clare has worked at the Competition Commission, the Cabinet Office European Law Team, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and the Department for Exiting the EU. In 2018, Clare was chosen to lead the legal team at TRID, and a very warm welcome to Clare.
Yes, thank you, James. I would like to introduce you as well to Adam Gray. Adam is the head of Trade Remedies Domestic Policy in the UK Department for International Trade. He has worked in trade remedies for the past 3 years, and he has been covering the development of the UK's new trade remedies system. Adam has led the development of the new investigation and review processes and is also leading on setting up the legislative framework under which the new system in the UK operates. Since joining civil service back in 2003, Adam has worked in a variety of policy roles across government that included higher education, consumer policy, corporate law, and also governance. So Adam, I can only imagine the very exciting challenges you have been dealing with for the past 3 years, the number of policy considerations and decisions that will shape the UK trade with defense policy for the next years that you and your team have been taking on a daily basis. So we are very, very glad to be able to have you with us today for this talk. Thank you. I will also present you Stephen Johnston, who is the head of analysis in trade remedies, trade disputes, and market access in the UK Department for International Trade. And in that position, he has also participated in the development of the UK as an independent trade remedies authority. He has worked as a trade policy economist on trade remedies and a wide range of other trade issues for more than 25 years already for the UK government. And before that, Stephen was also an economic advisor on regional policy, competition policy, and industrial policy. Stephen, you have been working with trade defense for a number of years. You represented the UK government in the EU Trade Defence Instruments Committee back in Brussels, together with representatives of the other EU countries. So you know perfectly well how EU trade defence works, the aspects in relation to which the UK and the EU share their views, those in relation to which the views were not that much shared. So it is also very, very good and very exciting to have you with us today to share how you believe will be shaped this new practice, this independent practice of the TDIs in the UK. And finally, I would like to introduce to you John Lundergan, who is a former deputy head of unit at DG Trade at the European Commission. He was working with the European Commission for over 30 years, and that was until 2016. Over there, he initiated as a trade defense investigator, and then he became a deputy head of unit, where he was one of the things that John did over there was that he was leading the Commission's team in the recent TDI, what we call modernization of the EU rules on all those instruments that we will be discussing today. So John has been working as a senior advisor with Gide since 2017. And I'm also very happy that he's here to complete this scenario and this panel that allows us to have both visions, EU and UK, with people really from the UK, with people really in the EU, and with people who are both in the EU and now are working with UK specifically. And just to finish on that, I work with John very regularly, so I think he can also add a lot to this webinar because he's one of those people who is knowledgeable on the topic, but also has this gift of explaining complex issues in a very clear and methodic manner, I like to say to John all the time. So thank you for all of you to being part of that webinar with us.
Excellent. So if we start with you, Claire, and perhaps we could ask you to give us an introduction to TRID, what it is that you are and will be doing.
Thank you, James. I wanted to briefly touch on 5 areas today. What are trade remedies and why do they matter? Who we are at TRID and what we do. How we will carry out our investigations. What we have done so far and where you can find out more information. So what are trade remedies? Well, trade remedies are the tools to address unfair trading practices. They come from the WTO rules on trade, and there are 3 principal areas. Anti-dumping measures, which are to protect against cheap imports which are causing injury to domestic UK producers. Countervailing measures, which are to protect against foreign subsidies which are causing injury. And safeguard measures, which protect against an unforeseen surge in imports causing serious injury. Why do trade remedies matter? Well, trade remedies help protect businesses against injury caused by these unfair trading practices. They usually take the form of additional duties on imports and can be significant. They are generally in place for 5 years and can be renewed. They are an important part of free trade. They provide UK industry with the ability to maintain fairness and competitiveness if they are threatened by dumped or unfairly subsidised imported goods. The UK has an incredibly diverse manufacturing sector, and it is important that as we leave the EU, businesses have the right tools and framework in place to protect them against unfair trading practices. So who are the Trade Remedies Investigations Directorate, or TRID as we like to call ourselves? We're currently part of the Department for International Trade. And when the Trade Bill, which is currently in Parliament, is passed, we will become an independent arm's-length body, the Trade Remedies Authority. We are an operationally independent unit that will carry out investigations into dumping, subsidies and surges in imports, and we will make recommendations to the Secretary of State on trade remedy measures. We have about 100 staff based in Reading, made up of investigators who are assigned to specific cases, and analysts, lawyers and corporate services team who work together to support the investigation process. We will carry out transition reviews of EU trade remedy measures. There are 43 EU measures that the Department for International Trade have identified as being relevant to the UK, covering a wide range of sectors, including steel, ceramics and chemicals. We will review each of these measures before it expires and assess whether it should be maintained, varied or revoked. We will also consider applications for new anti-dumping, countervailing and safeguard measures. In all of these cases, we will make recommendations to the Secretary of State, who will take the final decision applying a public interest test. The Secretary of State cannot make a different finding, but they can reject our recommendation if they do not consider it is in the public interest. So how will we carry out our investigations? Well, the investigations are quite complex, and we will be collecting and analysing data to assess whether there is dumping or foreign subsidies which are causing injury to UK producers, and what measures to recommend to remedy the injury. So this involves issuing quite detailed questionnaires to UK industry and to overseas exporters to collect, for example, costs and sales data, and then carrying out verification of the data received. We need this data to be able to calculate the dumping margin or the amount of the subsidy and assess what remedy is needed to address any injury being caused to UK industry. We will draw our preliminary conclusions together into a statement of essential facts before making a final determination and recommending a remedy, if appropriate, to the Secretary of State. We can only recommend a remedy where it also meets a UK economic interest test. And in dumping and subsidy cases, there is a statutory presumption that this is met. We are really keen to operate in a digital and transparent way. We have a digital platform on gov.uk called the Trade Remedies Service, which has all the information about our live cases. Parties to a case can register to upload their documents and submissions and to receive information about the case. So what have we done so far? To date, we have been developing our policies and procedures to start doing investigations, and information and guidance on these can be found on gov.uk. We have also now launched 2 transition reviews. The first of these was launched on the 10th of February and concerns welded tubes and pipes of iron or non-alloy steel from Belarus, China and Russia. It is a transition review of the anti-dumping measures imposed by the EU, in which the additional duties of between 10.1 and 90.6% were originally imposed. The second transition review concerns rainbow trout from Turkey and launched on the 4th of March. It involves countervailing measures imposed in respect of subsidies in Turkey and the EU imposed duties of between 6.7 and 9.5%. So finally, where can you find out more information? We have quite a lot of information now on gov.uk, including information about what are trade remedies and transition reviews, guidance on how we will run our investigations, and you can also register your interest in a specific case on our online trade remedies service. For new cases, you can also contact us directly. We have a pre-application office which is up and running, and their contact details are also on gov.uk, and we can also provide them after the webinar today. Thank you. Thank you, James.
Excellent. Thank you, Claire. And now we'll pass over to Anna to explore the policy considerations and the experience that DIT have had in mind over the last years when creating Trade.
Yes, I would. Yes, maybe I would like to start by with a question to Adam Gray. Adam, you've been dealing with the team in setting the legislative framework for the new UK system, and it would be very interesting to hear a little bit from you on the overreaching principles that guided the policy design of this new system. By knowing that the UK now, as was mentioned, operates its new independent trade policy with regards to trade defence, and which has been an area, at least that's how it's perceived back in Brussels, that where the UK has been traditionally a bit reluctant to support measures while it was a member of the WTA, of the EU, sorry. So we are curious to know, for instance, how much of the UK's policy was inspired on following the same policy lines of the European Commission, how much of it is actually different from what the UK had to follow before, and that it now can establish on its own as an independent body. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So going back all the way to the beginning of this whole road that we've been travelling, we set out 4 principles that would guide the UK's trade remedies system. And those 4 principles are impartiality, proportionality, efficiency, and transparency. So these were, as I say, right from the get-go, set in stone to establish what our governing principles were, and everything that we've done since then, from the establishment of TRID and in future the TRA, through to the laying of the detailed secondary legislation, has mirrored those and represented those in law. Impartiality. So this hopefully should be a fairly obvious principle. We want our system to be impartial and objective, and that informed the original decision to set up the TRA as an arm's length body and separate out the data collection analysis function from any political interference. So that's the rationale behind that. And also the decision, which I'll come on to in a moment, of making sure that everything is transparent, because that's a key part of that objectivity. In terms of proportionality, we were also keen to make the point that, as far as the UK is concerned, trade remedies shouldn't be punitive. They are a proportional response to injury that's been sustained by UK industry. And all of our key principles in legislation are built around making sure that measures are put in place to address that injury, to provide a level playing field. And to that end, we have made in law the requirement for the what's known as the lesser duty rule, which Stephen will be, I'm sure, covering in a bit more detail in a moment. But I just want to link that to this sort of proportionality point. The third point in terms of principles was efficiency. And we were keen because we know that involvement in a trade remedies investigation or review is unavoidably costly by its very nature for business. And we wanted to approach this in a way that would be as efficient and non-burdensome to business as possible. So first of all, there were some things in our favour, in that being a sovereign nation, we don't have to run any proposed measure past all our member countries, which the EU obviously does, which streamlines things a little bit. But also, we were quite ambitious in our targets for how we want an investigation or a review to be run by Trade and the TRA. And finally, transparency. This was something, again, we were very keen on. We'd spoken to a number of different countries around the world when we were developing this, and the general principle of the UK government is one of transparency anyway. We're keen to allow businesses to understand our thinking and our reasoning. And that translated into our legislation in requiring Trade and the TRA to operate a public file. So everything that is submitted by interested parties and contributors to an investigation or review that is A, materially relevant to the investigation, and B, is non-confidential, will go on that public file. Confidential documents won't go on that public file, but one of the requirements in law is that when a body or when an organisation is submitting evidence that is confidential, they are also required to submit a non-confidential version. So all that we can do to provide information to participants and the wider public, we're doing. There is actually a fifth sort of non-official principle that I think you sort of alluded to, Anna, which is consistency. We were very aware coming into this that, as Olivier pointed out, we haven't done this in the UK on our own for over 40 years. Businesses that have been involved in trade remedies in the past in the UK have been operating through the EU model, and we wanted to stick as closely to that as possible in a way that would provide confidence and consistency to those businesses. So we haven't veered away from the EU model for the sake of veering away. We've made changes where they make sensible, logical, justified sense to be different. But generally speaking, we've approached matters in a way that is consistent with the EU. I hope that covers things sufficiently.
Great, thank you, Adam. And it's very interesting to hear you talk about that, because it is indeed, when you mention very clearly efficiency and you talk about cost efficiency, it's something that is of concern of companies. How do I accede to this kind of procedures? And the transparency issue, I think we'll be able to talk a little bit about that as well. It's something that created a big buzz in the European Commission. There was a time when this was reflected, do we do it or not? But for now, the UK is doing it, and it's not yet the case. So it may come as a surprise to you companies on this kind of cases, but it's very interesting, and you I believe you touched this in a very clear way to structure to us how the reasoning behind everything for you. So thank you. And that, because you mentioned as well, one of the issues on the proportionality is the lesser duty rule. That brings me to a question to Stephen, because there are a number of specific issues in relation to each. We are keen to see whether the conduction of anti-dumping, anti-subsidy investigations will follow or not the practice of the EU Commission over the past years. So it would be interesting to hear what the UK Department for International Trade has learned from the UK's time as a EU member, and you were there participating on that process, what it wants to follow, or on the opposite, what it wants to make differently this time. And just to give a quick example, an issue that has raised a lot of interest from companies we have been talking to is the issue of the economic interest. And maybe you could guide us through a little bit how this economic interest was set in the UK, because there's also a double test in the UK that is a bit different, but not that different from the EU Commission. And also the lesser duty rule, which is an evolution that just came up with the European Commission to try to not use it. And maybe if you can explain to us a little bit of what it is and what is the intention of the UK Department in relation to these issues, and any other issues that you believe are more relevant and interesting to share with us today. Thank you, Stephen.
Okay, thank you, Anna, and thank you to Gide for giving us, Claire, Adam and I, the opportunity to talk about our brand new shiny remedies framework. As Anna said, I have worked actually on trade remedies on and off for more than 25 years, and one thing struck me. The very first case I came across actually was was actually a UK specific measure, and it was taken under the European legislation that used to allow for what were called regional cases. So that was in the early 90s. So the very first case was actually UK specific, and I think we've come full circle now. So we're back to UK specific measures. That case, by the way, is still around along with me. It's now applied at the European level, so it's very interesting in that sense. I think, yeah, I wanted to talk about 3 very specific areas in relation to the UK regime. I mean, as Anna said, literally there were hundreds and hundreds of decisions had to be taken on individual aspects of the framework, but these 3 seem to me to stand out as very significant in certainly in economic terms. To me, that's important, but I think also to the UK government's principles, particularly the one of proportionality and also transparency, which comes into this as well, I think. So those 3 things I want to talk about are the lesser duty rule, and I'll try and explain for those that aren't familiar with that what that is, the economic interest test, and a third thing, which is a new innovation called the market share threshold. So what is the lesser duty rule? The lesser duty rule is essentially allows the authority, or in our case demands that the authority only impose a duty up to a level that removes the injury to the UK industry if that is lower than the actual level of dumping or subsidy in a case. So for example, if you found a dumping rate of 50%, sometimes it's 100%, but you concluded that a duty of say 20% would be sufficient to remove the injury from that dumping, there's a requirement to impose a 20% duty. The second one is the economic interest test, where we are pretty much continuing what the Commission does, which is to, in every single case, apply a test to ensure that the impact of the measures on the wider UK economy are not disproportionate to the benefits, and the obviously benefits are to the domestic producers being protected by those measures. And I say disproportionate, it's not a simple cost benefit analysis. It is a disproportionate test. So there is a presumption, certainly in the case of anti-dumping and anti-subsidy measures, that measures should be imposed unless it can be shown that the costs of doing so are disproportionate. The third innovation is something called a market share threshold, and this means that TRID will have the power to not investigate an application that's otherwise meets the various criteria if the market share achieved by the producers involved, the UK producers, is below a certain level, and it's a very low bar. Its default is 1%, and I'll try and explain a bit more about why we decided to do that. Now, the lesser duty rule, Adam talked about continuity with EU practice, and of course, but for a long time the EU practice was to impose the lesser duty rule in every case, and it's only recently that it's departed from doing that and now has the option, not always necessarily doing it, to not use the lesser duty rule in cases involving subsidy or raw materials or input distortions. So why did we decide not to follow the Commission practice? I think that's the question we've probably most often been asked about this. I mean, anyone familiar with the history of this will know that the UK argued strongly to retain the lesser duty rule whilst it was a member of the European Union. Why did we do that? And firstly, I think it comes to this proportionality point. Like it or not, all anti-dumping and anti-subsidy measures have benefits, but they also can impose costs on the rest of the economy. Now, at times, anti-dumping and anti-subsidy cases can become quite fractious between the producers, the people who produce the product, and those who buy it. So we felt it was important to add an extra layer of a test to ensure that whilst we are removing the adverse effects of dumping and subsidy, we're imposing a minimum cost on the rest of the economy. And I think that's the key word. So it will not stop us addressing the injury caused by dumping or subsidy, but it's kept the if you like, adverse effects or collateral damage to the rest of the economy at a minimum. Another reason why we decided to do this was the evidence. Now, we strongly believe, and we've always strongly argued, that the actual evidence suggests that where the European Union has imposed measures based on the lesser duty rule, in the majority of cases, that has been very effective in curtailing the dumped or subsidized imports. We looked at, for example, many steel cases and found in the vast majority of those where the lesser duty rule had been applied, imports actually fell more than 90% and didn't recover. There are always exceptions, but the weight of the evidence we felt suggested that the lesser duty rule was effective. And indeed, the Commission's own evaluation of trade defence instruments, which was undertaken, I think, in 2012, also came to that conclusion and felt that the lesser duty rule was both effective and was something worth carrying on. On the economic interest test, as I say, we're essentially following, I think, Commission practice on that. Now, some people say, well, the Commission doesn't really use the community interest, as it's called there. They don't usually use this test. It's there, but it doesn't actually have any practical impact. I mean, I'm sort of inclined to disagree with that. I think it does have an impact. In a few cases, it is relatively few cases, the application of the union interest test has led to measures not being adopted or terminated. But it also has other angles to it. For example, it can be used to modify the duration of measures, and there are a few cases where that's happened. It can be used to modify the scope of measures. I can think of one example, at least, footwear. Provisionally, at least, the Commission decided not to impose provisional measures on children's footwear because of union interest considerations. And it can also provide a hook to make decisions about the form of measures. So in some cases, for example, the Commission would have decided not to impose duties, straight duties on an ad valorem basis, but may have opted instead for say, a minimum import price where the duties aren't applied to all imports, but only imports below a certain price level. And I have to say, in terms of the single most important anti-dumping case that I ever saw over the years, that was solar panels, the union interest arguments were very important in actually leading to the eventual termination of those measures. So I think there are lots of reasons why we would want to sort of pursue this. And as Adam said, we're looking for measures that remedy things and not punitive. I think there's also an aspect of transparency to this as well. The economic interest test does give certain parties the sort of ability to participate in an investigation where perhaps they wouldn't feel they have a stake. So, for example, users or consumer groups and unions, they can all, really the ability for them to have a voice in the investigation partly stems from the fact that there's an economic interest test. I should also emphasize that on the economic interest test, if TRID find that test is not met, that is the end of the matter. If TRID find that are recommending measures and find that the economic interest test is passed, satisfied, then only then can a case go forward to the Secretary of State for a decision. The final thing, and I'll be very brief here, market share threshold. We all know that investigations are expensive. They're expensive for government, they're expensive for the companies, and I know lawyers sort of enjoy some benefits from that, but we wanted to avoid investigations that we thought probably wouldn't end up going anywhere. As we have an economic interest test, we thought it prudent to sort of apply, if you like, a triage test to the case, to weed out those cases where we felt that it was very, very unlikely that TRID would end up recommending measures, and those are where the UK producers concerned have a market share of less than 1%. You know, the time of TRID, there's an opportunity cost to that, and every case that they pursue probably comes at the expense of something else, inevitably in life. So we thought it best that TRID focus their attentions on the important cases and not cases that may not go anywhere. I'll leave it there and see how we go. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stefan. And I see you, because when you mentioned this last point about the threshold, you were making some tough decisions that, yes, indeed, it's discussions that also happen in the European Commission with some of our cases. And I understand those are, yes, policy and difficult decisions to make. I would just make one slight comment because it brings me to a question that would be interesting to ask John. It's just a comment that I fully agree, and it's really here to give the contradiction on the basis of our experience in the past. I do agree that the application of the lesser duty rule at the injury level was normally sufficient to save what was happening of bad in the market. But I have the impression that this changed a bit with the new and strong and aggressive state interventions that some countries are making. And here I can name an example, which is China. And I think it's one of the examples where we see this kind of cases evolving at the European level. So that brings me to John, because John, you have been on the other side, and on the other side today, I mean, of course, the EU Commission side for a long time. And you are well placed to share with us your views on the matters raised so far, and notably on those two issues of economic interest and the lesser duty rule that Stefan just shared with us. Because it would be good to hear from you on the basis of your experience in the past, what you believe brought the Commission to have recently changed this practice in 2018, because yes, the lesser duty rule was the rule in the EU, and it has now recently changed just a certain number of cases. So it would be good to understand just this other side, why in the EU we are following a different path in relation to that. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Anna. And thanks for the earlier speakers. If I could, first of all, before coming to the lesser duty rule, if I could just add a little bit to what Claire has said about trade remedies and why they matter. I mean, most of you probably know that the European Union has been one of the traditional users of these instruments over the past 40 years or so. Although the UK's use actually goes back even further. You can stretch it back to the 1920s. I think it was one of the first users of these instruments well before joining the European Union. I mean, the instruments, I think they often get bad press. They're often spoken of as a kind of protectionist tool to be avoided at all costs. I mean, certainly when it comes to the European Union's use of the instrument, I think this is hardly the case. I mean, if you look at the statistics, usually only around 1 to 2% of imports into the EU at any one time would be subject to anti-dumping or anti-subsidy measures. Also, the European Commission, which is responsible for the trade defense investigations, doesn't self-initiate cases. They're responsive to requests from industry. And that's not to say that they accept all allegations of dumping or subsidization. I mean, the thresholds in terms of evidence for initiating an investigation are quite high, and many initial contacts I know with the Commission are rejected as they don't meet those thresholds. So some industries who think they might have a problem, the problem is often not dumping, it's something else, and the Commission would reject those type of requests for investigation. I mean, they're very targeted instruments. They're aimed at unfair imports, specific products from specific countries, where companies are engaging in these practices of dumping, subsidization, sometimes predatory in nature, which is the classic dumping, but not so many. More recently, certainly in the case of China, I think the state actions there give a grossly unfair advantage to Chinese exporters. As we know, China has been the subject of many or most of the investigations in the European Union over the last 15 years or so. In China, for example, it was already touched on briefly, distortions in the price of raw material inputs give exporters often huge unfair advantages that are not based on real comparative advantages. The subsidy rules, which have been used more and more in the European Union, these are aiming at counteracting the negative effects of subsidization, which have become quite widespread in the last 15 to 20 years and possibly will continue to grow in the current pandemic crisis. Let's see, time will tell. On the subsidy side, you know that in the European Union, there are strong state aid rules aimed at controlling subsidies given by member states. And these anti-subsidy rules can somewhat be seen as an equivalent to international state aid rules. So why do they matter? They're effective instruments. What are the alternatives to getting some relief from dumping subsidization? I know in the past, the Commission often had, let's say, offers from industries or countries to sit down and discuss solutions to allegations of dumping and subsidization. But the Commission has always rejected these type of requests to, can I say, manage trade in some other way outside of the rules of the internationally accepted rules of dumping and subsidization. So they have a very important role to play in re-establishing the level playing field, as we always say, and they are effective and can be immediately effective and helpful to industry. So they were just a few general comments in reaction to Clare's intervention. More specifically, Stephen spoke a bit about the economic interest test, or the union interest test, as we call it in the European Union. And this is one of the WTO plus elements of the EU's trade defense instruments. It's the WTO requirements set a minimum threshold or optional elements, additional elements that some members implement. And in the European Union, this is one of the extra elements that it has chosen to implement. In fact, the European Union has been the only consistent user of such a test among all countries worldwide. As far as I recall, Australia, Canada use it occasionally, but not in this systematic way of the European Union. Why do they do it? The European Union, I think, has traditionally felt, as this is something Stephen touched on, that the interest of other parties like importers, users, even consumers for consumer products like footwear and TV want to be heard, and that their interests should be taken into account before deciding whether or not to impose anti-dumping or anti-subsidy duties. In fact, there was a former UK Trade Commissioner, Sir Leon Britton, who actually deepened the union's economic interest test in the mid-1990s. He was a strong believer that other parties should have a role to play, should be heard before decisions are taken. So while the interests of the complaining union industry are clear, with this test, the Commission also looks at the economic consequences on the other economic operators of taking or not taking measures. And all interests, and this is something Stephen referred to as well, I think that then there's a kind of a balancing of the interests to see would it be disproportionate or not to impose measures. In practice, I have to admit, there have not been many cases where the European Union has decided not to impose measures on the ground of the union interest test. This is fundamentally linked to the requirement under EU law that the Commission has to clearly conclude, it must clearly conclude that measures would not be in the union interest in order for measures not to be imposed. So it's quite a high threshold to be met for measures not to be imposed. But that's not to underestimate the importance of the test. Again, this is something Stephen touched on. You know, even if measures are to be imposed, the test has sometimes influenced the Commission in deciding on the types of measures. Minimum price undertaking can be accepted from exporters instead of imposing a duty. This is certainly more palatable outcome for exporters, but also for importers where it maybe gives more certainty about import pricing. Sometimes the Commission has imposed a fixed amount of duty, euros per ton, rather than the classical percentage ad valorem duty. The duration of measures, which Stephen has already mentioned as well, has also been, rather than the normal 5-year duration of measures, the union interest test has sometimes led the Commission to impose measures for a shorter period. So I mean, I think it's fair to say that the economic test or the union interest test it's an important part of the EU's examination of whether measures are warranted and at what level. And I think it will continue to play an important role. On the lesser duty rule, yeah, and as you mentioned, there have been some changes. Stephen mentioned it as well in the recent past on the lesser duty rule. I mean, on the one hand, it's something that's always been in the DNA of the European Union. And, you know, frankly, it's still there in a different format, let's say. It traditionally looked at the lesser duty rule in every case, calculating the injury margin, seeing if a duty less than the dumping margin would be sufficient to remove the injury. Back in 2018, however, following a long modernization process, as it was called, in fact, I was involved in the early stages of it myself before I left the Commission. So in 2018, at the conclusion of that process, following long discussions with stakeholders, with member states and the Parliament, there were the first kind of package of substantial amendments to the trade defence regulations in more than 20 years. I think it was the right time to modernize certain aspects of the regulations. And one of the more significant changes was the partial removal, not the full removal, let's call it the partial removal of the lesser duty rule in anti-dumping investigations. Industry, as well as the Commission, most member states, I would say, the European Parliament, were concerned that, you know, a number of countries, many countries, interfered in the trade of raw materials on their domestic markets with a view to keeping raw materials in those countries for the benefit of domestic downstream users, for instance, by imposing export taxes or operating dual pricing schemes. These actions were creating, they do create an oversupply in the domestic market, which lowers domestic prices. It was felt, the Commission felt, and certainly the industry felt that this was a grossly unfair advantage given to exporters, let's say on top of, you could view it on top of the classical dumping, that this was something that state-induced gave them an additional advantage. The Commission decided then that we should take this, they should take this issue into account in deciding whether or not to apply the lesser duty rule. So what the Commission now does is examine certain criteria to examine whether or not the lesser duty rule should continue to be applied. It's done on a case-by-case basis, case-specific information is gathered and analyzed. I mean, even in a recent case on a steel product, which the Commission published some time ago, the Commission provisionally decided to continue to apply the lesser duty rule, as they consider that the impact on one big user in the Union of a high duty would have a disproportionate effect on its supply chains and financial situation. So they did their analysis and decided that they would continue to apply the lesser duty rule. So, you know, it is really, as we see it for the moment, a partial removal. The Commission is still in the early days of implementing these revised rules. There have not been so many cases since the rules were changed. So it'll be interesting to see to what extent it continues to apply the lesser duty rule or not in future cases. I think, Dana, that's all I will comment for the moment on the point.
Yes, thank you very much, John. Indeed, as you just mentioned, we it seems like there are some changes in relation to the European system, but in practice, most things are quite similar. It remains quite similar from what it was with the EU. The public interest test, it's a different test. It's written a little bit different, but I think the idea is still to impose measures unless we really see an issue with proportionality. And again, the lesser duty rule, for us, it was a bit disappointing because we consider the Commission went quite far in how much it requests for excluding the not using the lesser duty rule. But then again, it's another discussion. But just to say that for now, as of today, it's not that different from what you are starting to apply over there in the UK. I think we covered a number of policy issues and then some specific details of policy as well on how rules are applied. And maybe we could, I would suggest we move now to some basic WTO criteria on the application of measures. And I would come to Clare to ask you a question on some specificities in relation to UK trade defence procedure, so that those who are listening to us today, they can understand really on a step-by-step basis, what do I have to show to have a case, what kind of criteria do I have to meet. We know that there is a lot of the rules that are the same as in the EU because they are just a basic transposition of the WTO rules that every member has to follow. And then you have some specificities, which is what we call the WTO plus provisions, that each country decides to go beyond what the WTO obliges used to do. So maybe we could hear a little bit from you on those basic criteria and maybe a little bit as well on what the UK has chosen to apply as WTO plus as a policy concern internally as well. Thank you, Clare.
Thank you, Anna. And it's been very interesting for me coming into this field for the first time. And it's great to have some, real experts on the panel today. In Reading, setting up TRID, we've been having a lot of training, on this area, and particularly on dumping. And dumping does sort of concern really the majority of cases. And I thought it might be helpful just to talk through a little bit of that, and do welcome people on the panel to join me and jump in too. So, looking at dumping, the various sort of steps we need to go through. And as you say, these very much come from the WTO rules. So the first stage for us really is to try to calculate the dumping margin. So we are looking at essentially the price at which like goods are being sold at in the exporting country, and comparing that, we call that the normal value. And we're comparing that normal value with the export price to the UK. A dumping margin is found when there is a difference between the price in the exporting country and the exporting price to the UK, and particularly if the exporting price to the UK is lower than the normal value in the exporting country, we know that dumping is taking place. So we're looking at normal value. That's the first stage, and that is the comparable price in the ordinary course of trade of like goods destined for consumption in the exporting country. So it's very much, looking for a comparable price for the like goods in the exporting country. There are situations, and our legislation provides for this, where because of a particular market situation in the exporting country, the like sales do not allow for a proper comparison between those goods and the other goods. So that might be because that particular market situation might be because the prices in the exporting country reflect non-commercial factors, prices in that exporting country are artificially low, or our guidance points out that it could be due to other government interventions in the exporting country too. So we may choose to use an alternative method to calculate the normal value. We may have to construct normal value using the evidence and data that we have. So that's the first stage, calculating the normal value of the goods in the exporting country. The second stage is calculating the export price, and we will have information in response to questionnaires to enable us to do that as well. We then need to conduct a comparison between those two. We have to make a fair comparison between those two, and that may involve making some adjustments either side to make sure we're comparing prices at the same level of trade, and just making some adjustments to make sure we make that fair comparison. and we will then calculate the dumping margin. We then have to move on to consider injury and causation. So we need to assess next whether, if we have a dumping margin, look at whether that is causing material injury to the UK industry. So for this, we're particularly looking at things around the volume of the dumping and the price effects. So we're looking to see, is it having the effect of undercutting prices in the UK, of significantly depressing or suppressing domestic prices of like goods produced in the UK. So we're looking very much at those volume and price effects, and then also at the consequent impact that is having on UK industry. So, you know, the volume effects, the price effects, and then really looking at a range of economic factors to see what impact that is having on UK industry. So that can be things around, you know, decline in sales, profits, output, reduction in market share, negative effects on cash flow, employment, you know, ability to raise capital investment. So that's our, you know, the assessment of injury. We then will sort of look at causation to see, you know, is the dumping, you know, causing that injury, and particularly there, we're interested to see if there's anything particularly breaking that causal link. You know, are there other factors affecting the UK industry other than the dumping that might break that causal chain? So those are the steps that we will essentially go through. And then we've talked quite a lot today about the lesser duty rule. You know, once we've been through the steps of, you know, establishing a dumping margin and looking at injury and causation, we will, you know, be looking at the then what remedy to impose to address that injury. And under the UK rules that bring into play the lesser duty rule, we're looking to find the minimum increase in import price that would address the injury. So that we call that the injury margin. So the next stage for our investigators is to really sort of look at calculating an injury margin, you know, that minimum increase to address the injury. And to do this, they will look to calculate what they call a target UK selling price. So they're very much looking at, you know, what's that price that UK producers would be selling at were it not for the injury. You know, that price that they need to sort of have to address the, you know, the minimum increase to address the injury. And the difference between that and the export price essentially forms the injury margin. So we have our dumping margin, we have the injury margin, and essentially under our rules, as you've heard, we'll be applying the minimum increase to address the injury. So hopefully that's covered some of the basic steps that we'll be going through, and welcome comments from others.
Thank you, Claire. And I think it's very important to give this really step-by-step analysis, because an issue we see, and I believe you have seen since you started all this process, is that so many companies are not aware at all about those rules and how do they apply. And it's good for them just to visualize a little bit and understand that when they are facing competition, and one of their issues is competition, unfair competition from another country, there is something to be done. It's technical, but it's feasible and it can be shown, and you guys will be supporting them to have that. So I think it's very useful for them. Thank you. I would just still ask you one question, Claire, continuing on the procedures. You mentioned a bit earlier today that the anti-dumping, anti-subsidy and safeguard measures that were identified in the beginning as being of interest to the UK will be subject to a review. And I wanted to ask you just whether this review is similar to what we have in the EU administrative review, or is it much closer, in fact, to a new application to initiate an investigation? And I finished this question with one comment. We will get to the comments later, but because there's one person who already made a comment on that, so I will just bring that to you. So Peter Holmes from University of Sussex raised the issue of the China suggestion that the UK transition reviews are illegal in the WTO context, and asked for a comment. So yes, we saw that you have received some comments from China and Russia, considering that your reviews would be WTO incompatible. So we would also be happy if you could share some thoughts with us on this. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, a particular thing that we will be doing at TRID is these transition reviews. And I think this is, really a really important part of our work, as well as, doing assessing new applications for dumping and subsidy measures. We will be doing these transition reviews, and they are a particular feature for us. And under the rules that we're applying, we will be very much doing a fairly full review as to whether the measure in place should be varied, maintained or revoked. Under the rules, we have to assess whether the continuing application of the measure is necessary to offset the dumping and import of subsidised goods, and whether there would be injury if the measure were no longer in place. So, our investigations teams are really following quite a sort of normal trade remedy investigation process for these transition reviews. Following the initiation of the case, we publish a notice of initiation, and then, issuing questionnaires to assess, dumping, subsidy, and injury. And, as I said before, the questionnaires, we will then carry out verification of the data we receive. We'll be pulling that together into a statement of essential facts and a final determination, and assessing whether to vary, revoke, or maintain the measure. We will also actually, as part of the transition review, be applying the economic interest test. So if we want to vary, which includes within that maintaining the measure, we have to confirm that the UK economic interest test is met. So it's really quite a full process. Expecting it to take the sort of normal duration of a new application or another review to assess those questions of whether the application of the measure is necessary and whether injury would occur if it were removed.
Sorry, can I come in on that as well? Sorry, I just think it's worth remembering as well that there is a risk associated with these transition reviews that we've, the Chinese and the Russians have obviously raised, but the alternative was to just allow these measures to lapse. So in order to approach this, we think we've done, due diligence in that we've carried out a comprehensive call for evidence at the back in 2017, 2018 to assess which measures are of specific interest to the UK and should be transitioned. That's not even a finished sort of thing. That opened and closed, but we're also still considering any new definitive measures that the EU puts in place all the way up to the 31st of December this year. But as I say, these are measures that we've identified. There are British industries that would suffer potentially if those measures were simply to vanish. The other thing to bear in mind is that those WTO rules didn't envisage the scenario that we find ourselves in. No one could have envisaged this, a good few years ago. So as part of a group of countries that are now leaving that body, we have to do what we can in our own interest to protect British industry. But we are committed to carry out these transition reviews to every single transition measure. They are primarily serving to look at the evidence base, which obviously when we transition them is Europe-wide data. So the key issue is to identify what the UK specific data is for all of these measures. And as Claire said, if it turns out that there's no justifiable reason for transitioning them, then we will terminate those measures. But we can't leave a gap and just drop 43 measures overnight. That would be less than ideal, should we say.
And as you point out, Adam, every measure that is transitioned will be reviewed as a matter of course. So those issues which may go to standing of applicants and that kind of thing will come up in the transition review. And so they will be addressed at that stage.
Well, standing of applicants is slightly different because there's no application for transition reviews. Transition reviews will just be automatically initiated for each of those measures that have been transitioned, and they will be it's for Trade to decide the order in which those measures, those reviews are carried out. But there's no need for applicants, for industries to apply for a transition measure. They will be carried out.
Right, thank you. Good. We've had a good discussion about the framework that's in place, and it would be interesting to hear how government has engaged with UK industry over the time that you've been working on this. And perhaps the starting point, Adam, is the call for evidence, which the Department for International Trade ran in late 2017 and early 2018. Perhaps you could say a few words about that and the results that you found at the end of it.
Sorry, just pause while I try to unmute myself. Apologies. Yes, so as I said, that we have this fairly comprehensive call for evidence that was looking at all of the measures that were in place at the EU at that time. So there were 103 EU measures, and we went out with an open public call for evidence, seeking views on each of those measures to see whether there are any industries in the UK, any manufacturers in the UK. We actively targeted those industries where there was a clear potential UK industry, and for each of those measures we assessed against 3 criteria. Firstly, we asked whether there was an application as part of the call for evidence for the measure to be transferred. Secondly, that application was at that point supported by the necessary portion of the UK industry, and that mirrored the WTO anti-dumping agreement rules and the countervailing measure rules. And then the third test was that they represented a market share of over 1%. So this was bringing in that market share threshold that we'd already talked about and applying it to this call for evidence process. So that opened in November 2017 and closed in March 2018. And then we actually reopened it again for an additional month between July and August 2018. And then final results were published, I believe, later that year. I don't have the precise date to hand, but that concluded that of the 103 EU measures, 43 measures passed those 3 tests and were of interest to the UK. So those are the ones that we identified at that time to be worthy of transitioning. And we published a notice. That outcome is available on our ungov.uk if you just do a Google search for it. And since then, we've also undertaken further mini calls for evidence for those specific measures that the EU has put in place subsequently. So there have been a few minor ones, and we'll continue to do that, as I said before, right up until we end this transition period. And then the core policy here is that we will transition those measures that are of interest to the UK as they stand on the 31st of December. But throughout all of that, and throughout the whole of the policy development, we've been actively engaging with stakeholders, industry groups. We were lucky enough that the UK stakeholders right at the start recognised the need to come together, and they formed the Manufacturing Trade Remedies Alliance to bring a lot of those voices together. But we've also been listening to other voices as well, especially where there's a specific interest has been raised.
Excellent. Thank you. That is interesting. And those 43 measures are the measures that will be transitioned at the end of this year. And yeah. I'm not sure, you can all speak to this, I'm sure, but perhaps one of you could give us a very short summary of the measure, how the measures will be transitioned. I don't know if that could be Clare, maybe. Yes.
So again, Adam, do jump in at any point, but essentially, they are transitioned across, and the UK government has committed that we will do a transition review investigation on each of those measures. Our work at TRID starts when the Department of International Trade issues a notice of determination to transition each of those 43 measures, following which we issue our notice of initiation to start our investigation process. So exactly as Adam said, these aren't reviews that parties actually have to apply for. They will all happen automatically, and they will start following the Department for International Trade publishing their notice of determination in respect of each of these, and we will then start our investigation process and follow that through.
Yes, as Claire said, the idea is that of the two that have already started, been initiated by TRID, so we published individual notices of determination for each of those two measures a day or so before TRID initiated, and we will do the same for the remaining uninitiated measures at the end of this year, just before the end of December, and then TRID will start as they see fit after that.
It might be worth adding, because it took me a while to sort of understand this coming into this field new, that there are 43 measures, but in a sense they span over a 5-year period, because each trade remedy measure is in place for about a 5-year period. So what we will be doing in TRID is making sure we do the review before it reaches the expiry point. So, you know, from now they've each sort of got a sort of 5-year expiry period, and we'll just need to make sure we start our investigation before the expiry point on each one. So effectively these transition review investigations do spread over a 5-year period.
Thank you both. And maybe Stephen, a question for you from the work that DIT has done to date. Do you see particular sectors of industry which anticipate having recourse to TRID, and are they beginning to take steps themselves to identify the margins that Claire touched on earlier?
I mean, our expectation initially, I mean, we know the 43 cases, and so we know the sectors involved, and all of those will clearly, and I hope, engage fully in the TRID reviews. You know, inevitably producers will want to maintain, or if possible increase, duty rates, but you know, that will be down to the facts. I don't think there's much one can say about that at this stage. Over the longer term, it's quite interesting, because I know in the introductory comments Olivier said that UK is a service sector and, you know, economy. But you know, I think one lesson we've all learned is that there are still an awful lot of manufacturers back in the UK. They're, you know, a diverse sort of set of industries, and what, you know, the thing about trade remedies, one never knows where the next case is coming from. We expect steel to feature heavily, we expect ceramics, and we expect chemicals to feature heavily. But there's all sorts of industries out there, and each of them will have the right to sort of make their case for protection where they feel there's evidence to justify that.
Okay, thank you. We discussed just before the webinar started that there is a real role for trade associations here, because a lot of the data that is required for the investigations is market wide, and associations have an ability to gather that data from their members. And Claire, I wondered if, I know that your chairman and CEO have been raising awareness, and perhaps you could expand on that slightly with regard to work that you've been doing with trade associations and any other bodies since you joined TRID.
Thank you. I mean, we really became operationally live in February when we started our transition reviews, and our new chair, Simon Walker, joined us too at that time, and he is particularly keen to engage with industry, and, you know, particularly sort of reaching out to trade associations, and we understand from you know, our conversation with the EU, with Australia, with Canada, that, you know, the trade associations can really help with these quite complex investigations, and can really help the members pull together the information and data that they need, both in terms of, you know, if they're considering applying for a new measure, because in making an application for a new measure, even that involves quite a process. It needs, you know, it's why it's really worth engaging with our pre-application office, if industry is considering this, because industry does need to sort of put together information about the allegations of dumping or subsidy. They also need to have what we call the standing rules that apply in new cases, whereby the application will need to be supported by 25% of the UK industry. That's the UK producers of the goods for consumption in the UK, and not opposed by sort of more than that percentage. So there's a sort of threshold requirement there. Producer support for the application is important and must represent 25% of the industry. So trade associations can be really useful, I think, for industry to help them coordinate in that sort of application phase. But indeed throughout the investigation, we understand, particularly from colleagues in other authorities, that it can help sort of coordinate the information.
Thank you, Claire. That is interesting. I mean, we've touched on this topic now with everyone. I see Stephen's come back. You disappeared for a minute, Stephen. But I have a question for you. When we do move beyond the implementation period, new applicants will have to take a view on the market share requirement and whether they are acting by or on behalf of the UK industry. I wondered, Stephen, if you could give us an indication of how trade associations and UK producers would go about doing that in terms of gathering the data and making the application so that would satisfy those criteria.
Yeah, I just make the distinction. I think it's an important distinction between the by and on behalf of criteria, which really relates to the WTO requirements for a new investigation. So that requires that the companies that want the investigation to proceed must account for 25% of UK production, and must also, in terms of their output, be larger than any group of countries that actively oppose the investigation. There is separately a market share requirement, which is that the industry as a whole, whether they're complainants or not, actually account for 1% of all sales within the UK. So I think in making an application, I think the companies concerned would need to at least have a fair idea of who produces within the UK and their approximate size. I don't think they need to be exact about this at this stage, at that stage anyway. So they need to have an idea of that, and ideally they need to have an idea for the market share test, an idea of how much stuff being imported into the UK and exported from the UK. That helps you sort of derive an estimate of the consumption in the UK market. To be honest, given that the market share threshold is set at a very low level, I think most industries will have a very good idea as to whether the market share threshold is likely to be in doubt or not. If it's marginal, then they can make their application, and I think at that point TRID will have to sort of prod and poke and try and sort of establish as accurate an estimate of these things as possible. I mean the standing test, the 25% test, again you just need to know there who else is producing in the UK. And most of the industries we come across, there are one or two producers, frankly, and maybe a tail of very small ones. So as part of the call for evidence, and you asked a question about standing on the transition measures, there was a standing test applied, as Adam mentioned, to applications for transition. Most of the industries that responded to that had no real problem in establishing that they met that criteria. And I don't think, most of them seem to have a good understanding of who else is operating in the market. There's, a smaller economy, it's easier really in a way than in the European Union, because you've got 28 member states to cover. We've got one country to cover, and I think most of the big players will know who else is in the market.
Thank you. We have already overrun. Perhaps now we should turn to some questions from the floor, as it were. And starting with one we received, I'm afraid I don't have the name in front of me of the person who asked the question, but how will increasing differences in TD measures applicable in the EU on the one hand and the UK on the other hand be handled under the Ireland Protocol to the withdrawal agreement after the transition period? I don't know if that's Adam or Claire is nodding, so I will mute myself and let one of you jump in.
Claire, are you okay to take that? Ooh.
I was going to suggest you, but let's both have a go at answering that one. So if I start, I mean, so yeah, obviously it's sort of quite a complex situation as we leave the EU, and we have the EU withdrawal agreement and Northern Ireland Protocol there. I mean, certainly for our perspective in Reading, TRID, we're very much operating within the legislation and the rules that DIT have set out for us. So, we will be carrying out our transition reviews and investigating new cases, and we will be doing that for the UK. We will, apply the calculations and make the assessment there, and it is a UK system, and really that's what we're investigating and making those recommendations. We haven't really thought too much from our perspective, from our operational perspective, about those the divergence from the EU and exactly how that will play out. As I say, we're very much concerned with looking at the data for what is happening within the UK, doing our investigation, making the recommendations, and obviously part of that is determining the remedy and determining the duty that we are recommending as part of that. But there are complexities there in terms of how that is then going to be applied. And Adam, I don't know if you've perhaps got anything more to add on that.
It's difficult to add much to that because it's still a somewhat fluid situation as the detail is ironed out. We are very, very conscious of the risks associated with divergence and of circumvention and things like that, and that's all factoring into the work that's being done at the moment to develop the detailed operating processes that will be applied at the border. Unfortunately, beyond that, there's little that I can really say because it's, as I say, it is a moving feast at the moment. But watch this space, and we will, as I say, we're aware of it. We are working on the process, but I can't say more.
Thank you both. Anna, I know that you have another question.
Yes, no, just because we discussed about the sectors in relation to which we expect the industry in the UK to be more active, and I was just thinking that maybe it's interesting to see also if, John, you have any comments on that. Well, from the time the UK was in the European Union and that you were working with those procedures, what were the kind of industries that were active and whether there were any issues coming from them or whether they were not for the measures, but maybe just some comments on your view of the UK when they were in the European Commission. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I'm conscious we're running out of time. However, steel is an obvious sector that for many, many years has used the instruments, used them effectively. The UK still has a steel industry, a number of steel producers. I would expect that they will continue to want to use this, particularly in the context of the massive expansion that there has been in China on production capacity. Frankly, overcapacity, excess capacity. I think it's somewhat inevitable, if I may say it, that UK producers will find themselves competing aggressively, which they do today. Well, they were doing within the context of the European Union. There's a global forum on steel excess capacity, which is all very desirable objectives, but frankly, the chances, I think, of getting something out of that would lead to a reduction in capacity worldwide, especially in China, is probably remote at this stage. So I think that's one area that has been a traditional user, will probably continue to be fertilizers. The UK still has a fertilizer industry. They have been traditional users for many, many years. Often imports from Russia. The particular specificity of Russia is the way it has a state regulation of gas prices, which gives their exporters enormous unfair advantages in terms of input pricing for gas is a huge input to many of the fertilizers, ammonium nitrate, urea, ammonium nitrate. I think I would expect the industry to want to keep measures in force against this type of unfair practices. In the past, the salmon industry had many cases. Not so many in recent years, I think, but they had been a traditional user. More recent sectors of industry where the UK has an industry, the biodiesel industry and the ceramics. The biodiesel industry originally was hit by massive imports of heavily subsidized biodiesel from the US. There were measures in place there for many years, anti-dumping and anti-subsidy. Follow-up to that then was the massive importations from Argentina of biodiesel, where there's measures in the form of a price undertaking with a quantity element in place at the moment, which is helping the industry. The ceramic sector was also somewhat of a latecomer to the trade defense instruments. I think it's a very fragmented industry, which makes it difficult to coordinate and lodge cases. But they've successfully lodged cases on ceramic tiles and ceramic tableware. Certainly in ceramic tableware, there's still significant production in the United Kingdom, as far as I'm aware. One particular element of the ceramics cases was the issue of retaliation. It's an unfortunate fact of life over the last 10 or 15 years that many European industries have felt threatened by retaliatory action if they were to lodge anti-dumping or anti-subsidy cases. To sort of try to alleviate this to a certain extent, the Commission has accepted that the identities of companies remain anonymous throughout the process to try to give them some relief from retaliation. Retaliation can take many forms. It could be blocking investments in the country subject to investigation, expansion, or whatever. Tit for tat investigations have been opened as a mere retaliation against an anti-dumping case. There have unfortunately been isolated instances of vandalism on private property in other countries as well. So this kind of anonymity to try to alleviate the retaliatory concerns. There have been more and more of them in recent years, and it's something that you may well face in the UK as well. There's some comments, Anna, on the usual suspects, let's say.
Thank you, John. I'll leave it to James. Maybe James, we go through one or two more questions, maybe from the audience.
Yes, good. Should I go ahead with one and then you can finish, Anna? We've had the same question twice and we've touched on it, but maybe let's address it head on. Is the audience has asked if applying EU trade remedies measures in the UK after the end of the transition period is going to be problematic at a WTO level, regardless of whether the transition reviews are ongoing. We touched on that earlier, Adam, and perhaps you want to deal with it again.
Yeah. Well, it is a risk, I think, is the simple answer to it. But in developing all of this, we have been very clear with the WTO. We've engaged with WTO Secretariat throughout the development of our transition policy. So they know what we're doing. Obviously, anything, if a formal dispute is brought, then it will be subject to the normal dispute process at the WTO. We will defend our policy and our approach to this. But yeah, short answer is it's something we're aware of. It is a risk that we factored into, but it's balancing that against UK interest in the short term. And hopefully we'll get through it smoothly enough, and then we will have definitive UK measures that are specific to the UK once the transitional reviews are done.
And as you pointed out earlier, the WTO anti-dumping agreement doesn't provide for a situation where a country leaves a customs union. So
no.
There's no way it could be dealt with under the AD agreement at the moment. Stephen, do you have anything to add on that before we go to Anna's last question?
No, I mean, except that, you know, the UK regards the measures that are being applied now as our measures as much as any other member state, and you know, that we have the right to transition them. We have removed quite a number of these measures through the call for evidence process. So where there's no UK production, we have, you know, said that we're going to remove the measures and we are going to review them. So it's an unprecedented situation, and who knows what other countries will do, but we can't control it. We have consulted, we've spoken to other countries, explained our approach. So we feel we've gone a long way to try and ensure that these measures are compatible.
Excellent, thank you.
Great, thank you. Maybe there were a number of interesting questions, but one that was maybe interesting because we have to close the webinar very soon. That is very general, and I let you see who prefers to answer on that one. But so the question is, would you say that there is more of a policy imperative at the EU level for trade remedies to seek to extend jurisdiction than there will be at TRA? Is the message the industry should expect a less interventionist position from the TRA? A bit provocative one from the audience.
I can sort of perhaps start off on that, but you know, as I was sort of saying earlier, I mean, we are very much operating within the legislation and rules that have been set out for us. We are an operationally independent unit, and you know, it is key for us to carry out thorough, impartial, evidence-based investigations. So you know, it's sort of difficult to sort of say much more than that, really. And as we were sort of discussing earlier, there's a lot of sort of detailed steps we have to go through in assessing, for instance, dumping. And we will apply each of the tests. We will look at the evidence on each of those parts, and then make our recommendations to the Secretary of State. You know, and that really is, you know, the process which we'll be following. You know, that there is the public interest. The Secretary of State will take the final decision and apply a public interest test. But really, for us, it's a thorough rules-based investigation we'll be carrying out.
Very good. Thank you, Claire. That was all very, very interesting, and I think I will give the floor now to Olivier to make his closing remarks on the very interesting elements we have heard from all of you today. Thank you.
Yes, well, I think it is now time to thank very much Clare, Adam, and Stefan for their time in the middle of this particular summer. At the beginning of this webinar, I say that our goal will be for the participants to have a good understanding of the new UK TDI rules. Of course, a lot will depend and will come from implementation of these rules, but I strongly believe that the objective is met and that participants are now in a much better position when they have to deal with those new rules. So, and if not, I'm sure Anna and James and John will be happy to guide you. Thank you all. Have a good day and take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.